My name is Mara Keaton, and for 11 years, my parents let everyone believe I was useless. Not troubled enough to worry about, not successful enough to brag about. Just useless in that quiet family way people say it, without using the word every time. They told my aunts I sorted books part-time at the Lancaster Library and still needed help paying rent. They told my sister Paige I was finding myself, which was my mother's polite phrase for disappointing her. I let them say it, because the truth would have given my father something sharper than gossip to hold against me. I was not shelving books. I was a digital evidence analyst in the Elder Justice Division of the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office. I reviewed forged powers of attorney, altered medical notes, suspicious withdrawals, and the kind of family paperwork that looks loving until you follow the money. My father, Richard Keaton, sold Medicare supplement plans to retirees and spoke at church luncheons about protecting seniors from fraud. If he had known what I really did, he would not have been proud. He would have prepared. At 6:42 on a Wednesday evening in May, my phone lit up with a photo from my grandmother Eleanor. It showed her old copper teapot upside down on the stove, its dented lid facing the back door. Beneath it were 7 words. The lemon tin has no buttons left. I did not call her back. If the teapot was upside down, someone was close enough to hear her. If the lemon tin was empty, something important had already been taken. My hands went cold, but my voice stayed steady when I requested the welfare check. 37 minutes later, I stood outside my grandmother's house with a local officer and an adult protective services worker. My father opened the door. Before I tell you what my father said in that doorway, you need to understand why an upside-down teapot could make me call the authorities faster than a scream. When I was 13, I won a statewide essay contest. It was only a certificate with a gold seal. But to me, at 13, it felt like proof that the world had made room for my name. My English teacher had shaken my hand in front of the class and said my writing had a voice older than its years. I carried that certificate home in my backpack like it was something breakable. Grandma Eleanor was in our kitchen when I showed it to my parents. She had stopped by with a lemon pound cake wrapped in foil, the kind she made whenever she said the house needed something sweet in it. My mother looked at the certificate first. She smiled with only her mouth. My father read the first line, then looked toward the living room, where Paige was sitting on the carpet with her arms folded, already upset because the attention was not hers. "Success is ugly," my father said, "when you use it to make your sister feel small." I remember looking down at the paper, confused, because I had not used it for anything. I had only brought it home. But in our family, even standing still could be called selfish if Paige felt shorter beside you. My mother touched my shoulder and said, "Maybe put it away for now, Mara. Don't make the evening harder." That was how things worked in our house. Paige's feelings were treated like weather. Everyone adjusted. My accomplishments were treated like furniture in the wrong place. Quietly moved, sometimes thrown out. Later that night, I found the certificate bent inside the kitchen trash beneath coffee grounds and an empty cereal box. I did not cry where anyone could hear me. I just stood there with my hand on the cabinet handle, staring at my name through a brown stain. Grandma found me. She did not gasp. She did not make a speech. She lifted the certificate out, wiped it carefully with a damp towel, and took me back to her house without asking permission. In her pantry, on the second shelf, she kept a yellow tin shaped like a lemon. Inside were old buttons from my grandfather's shirts, a hotel key from their honeymoon, and tiny things she said were too small for drawers, but too meaningful for the trash. She folded my certificate and placed it beneath the buttons. Then she put the copper teapot on the stove and turned it upside down. "If I ever send you a picture like this," she said, "it means I can't talk freely." She tapped the lemon tin. "And if I tell you the buttons are gone, it means someone took something they had no right to touch." I was 13. I thought she was making a game out of my hurt so it would not swallow me whole. But then she looked me in the eye and said, "Families like ours punish direct alarms, so we would need quiet ones." "Some people don't hate your failure, sweetheart," she said. "They hate the proof that you were never small." For 19 years, We never used that code. Not once. That was why, when the photo arrived that Wednesday night, I knew Grandma was not being sentimental. She was telling me someone had crossed a line she could no longer name out loud. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 48% right now, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. My father looked past me first, toward the cruiser parked at the curb, then toward the woman standing beside me with an on-call Adult Protective Services badge clipped to her jacket. His face changed so quickly, most people would have missed it. The irritation disappeared. Concern took its place. Not real concern. The kind he wore for pastors, bank managers, and women from church who brought casseroles when someone died. Mara, he said softly, as if my name itself was an apology he had to make for me. What have you done? Officer Owendale introduced himself. Tessa Monroe from APS did the same. My father stepped back just enough to seem cooperative, but not enough to invite us in. Behind him, my mother stood in the hallway wearing yellow dish gloves, though I could not hear water running. Celeste Keaton always understood props. A wet dish towel over one shoulder, a tired smile. A house that looked interrupted by unreasonable people. Eleanor is resting, Richard told them. She gets confused in the evenings. Mara has always been sensitive about ordinary family stress. He lowered his voice on the word sensitive, making it sound like a diagnosis without having to say one. Tessa did not smile. We still need to speak with Mrs. Pritchard. My mother touched her throat. This is humiliating. Eleanor will be so upset. I stood quiet. That was the hardest part. Not defending myself, while my father built a version of me in front of strangers. Not correcting every soft lie, as it came out dressed like concern. I had learned years ago that people like Richard counted on your anger. It made their calm look like truth. 12 minutes after he opened the door, I heard the slow scrape of slippers on wood. Grandma Eleanor appeared near the dining room entrance. Her gray cardigan was buttoned wrong, one side hanging lower than the other. One slipper was blue, the other was gray. Her hair, usually pinned neatly, even to take out the trash, had been brushed only on one side. Around her wrist was a red mark, thin and circular, where her medical alert band had been tightened too far. Tessa asked, "Mrs. Pritchard, do you feel safe here?" Grandma looked at my father before she answered. Half a second. Maybe less. "I'm fine," she whispered. Officer Dallett asked if he could speak with her privately. Richard started to object, then stopped when Tessa looked directly at him. My mother folded the dish towel twice, then twice again. As they moved Grandma toward the kitchen, my father passed close enough that his sleeve brushed mine. "You should have stayed the useless one," he whispered. I did not look at him. I opened the notes app on my phone and typed the words exactly as he said them, with the time, 7:31 p.m. When I looked up, Grandma was watching me from the kitchen doorway. Her foot moved slowly beneath the hem of her cardigan. A faded sewing box slid across the floor, stopping beside my shoe. I did not pick it up right away. That was what my father wanted people to forget about me. I knew better than to touch evidence without a witness. I kept my hands at my sides and looked at Tessa instead. "Mrs. Pritchard just moved that box toward me," I said. "Can you witness whether she wants me to have it?" My father made a sound behind me, small enough to be dismissed as a breath, sharp enough that I heard the warning inside it. My mother's hands froze around the towel. Officer Daly looked down at the box, then back at Grandma Eleanor, and for the first time that evening, no one in the hallway was pretending this was ordinary family stress. Tessa stepped closer to Grandma, keeping her voice low. "Mrs. Pritchard, do you want Mara to take this sewing box?" Grandma's fingers tightened around the edge of the kitchen counter. She was standing under the yellow light above the sink, and it made her look thinner than she was, like the house itself had been slowly taking pieces of her. She did not look at my father this time. "Yes," she said, "it's mine. I'm giving it to her." Richard moved before anyone asked him to. Not far, just one step forward, the kind a man takes when he is used to a room adjusting around his body. Eleanor collects things, he said. Old receipts, buttons, expired coupons. She gets anxious when people encourage the clutter. Grandma lifted her head. Her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. It is not clutter. That was the first clean line she had drawn all night. I took out my phone and photographed the sewing box where it sat beside my shoe. I included the baseboard, the corner of the rug, and the microwave clock in the background. 7:41 p.m. Then I asked Tessa to repeat what Grandma had said, and Tessa did, calmly, like she understood that sometimes dignity needed a witness as much as evidence did. Only then did I pick up the box. It was lighter than I expected. The lid was faded blue with tiny violets painted around the edge, the kind of thing Grandma kept because every old object in her house still had a person attached to it. A strip of masking tape crossed one side, yellowed with age. Grandma had written my name on it in pencil, not ink, as if she had wanted the option to erase danger before danger found it. My father stared at that pencil mark. For 1 second, the careful man disappeared. Not enough for Officer Dalle to call it a threat. Enough for me to know the box mattered. "Give that back," he said. Tessa turned toward him. "Mrs. Pritchard has stated she wants Mara to have it. She's tired," she answered clearly. "She doesn't understand what she's doing." Grandma took 1 step into the kitchen doorway. "I invited her," she said. My mother lowered the towel slowly, like she had just realized the room had changed. "Eleanor, please," she whispered. But Grandma kept looking at me. I did not open the box in that house. I did not open it in my car. I carried it against my ribs like something fragile and dangerous, thanked Officer Dalle and Tessa, and drove straight to my agency's secure office. Before I touched the latch, before I broke the tape, before I let myself wonder what my grandmother had hidden for me, I called my supervisor and said the words that could remove me from the only case that had ever felt personal. "I need to disclose a conflict." My supervisor, Dana Whitlock, did not ask whether I was sure. That was one reason I trusted her. She only said, "Do not open anything until someone else is in the room." Then she called Mateo Alvarez, the investigator on rotation that week, and told me to wait in evidence room 2, with the box on the table and my hands where the camera could see them. It was 8:36 p.m. when Mateo arrived, hair still damp from the rain, notebook already open. He had worked with me for 6 years and knew the difference between my calm voice and my real one. He did not ask if I was okay. He looked at the faded blue sewing box, then at me, and said, "You're recusing." I already told Dana. Good. That was all. No comfort, no pity, just procedure, which was the only kind of mercy I could accept without falling apart. We recorded the tape before cutting it. Mateo photographed the lid, the pencil mark, with my name, the worn corners, the latch. Then he opened it with gloved hands. Inside was not sewing. There was a brass key with a paper tag that read, Box 41. 3 bank receipts folded into a rubber band. A copy of a power of attorney. A handwritten medication list with 2 dosages circled in red. A black flash drive. A birthday card I had made for Grandma when I was 13, the glitter almost gone from the front. And beneath everything, 1 torn strip of yellow legal paper. "If he says Mara did it, start with Hearthline." Mateo read it once. Then again. "Hearthline?" he asked. I shook my head. "I've never heard of it." He ran the name through the state business registry first, then pulled the attached formation documents through the secure portal. Hearthline Senior Management LLC had been registered as a care coordination company for elderly clients. Its compliance officer was listed as Mara Keaton. My full legal name. My old college email. My birth date. An apartment address I had not used since I was 19. And an electronic signature that looked like mine because it had been mine once, on a scholarship form I signed before I understood that family could save your paperwork for reasons that had nothing to do with love. The power of attorney, named Richard as primary agent, with a witness signature from a woman who, according to Mateo's quick search, had moved to Florida 9 months before the signing date. The notary stamp belonged to an office that had closed the previous winter. Then we played the flash drive. Grandma sat on the edge of her bed, speaking softly toward the camera. If Mara is watching this, Richard has probably already told people she wants my money. She doesn't. He has been building that story longer than I wanted to believe. The video cut off at the sound of footsteps. I stared at the frozen frame of her bedroom wall and realized she had been afraid long enough to rehearse that sentence. Mateo closed the laptop slowly. He didn't just steal from her, he said. He built you into the exit plan. Mateo's words stayed in the room after he said them. Built you into the exit plan. I had spent most of my adult life believing my father's disappointment was careless. Cruel, yes. Repetitive, yes. But still careless. The kind of family insult people throw because it is easier than learning who you became after they stopped paying attention. That night, sitting under the white lights of Evidence Room 2, I understood something colder. Richard had been paying attention. The word useless did not become the family story until I was 21. Before that, I had been difficult, sensitive, dramatic, too serious, too quiet, too much like Grandma. But after I left college early for a training program, I refused to explain. Richard found the label that fit his purpose. Useless. Not dangerous. Not observant. Not trained to read financial records until the numbers started confessing. Just useless. At Thanksgiving, he would say it without saying it. Mara still likes simple work, he told Uncle Nolan one year, passing the cranberry sauce as if he were passing a fact. Some people are happier without pressure. My mother always softened the blade after he handed it to her. She's sensitive, Celeste would add. We try not to push. Paige learned the script so well she could perform it without looking up from her phone. When she bought her townhouse, partly with money my parents called an early gift, she posted a picture of the front steps and wrote, "Hard work pays off." Someone commented, "What's Mara doing these days?" Paige answered, "Still figuring herself out," with a laughing emoji and a little heart. I saw it. I did not answer. That was the part Richard understood best. I rarely corrected people. Not because the lies did not hurt, but because correcting them required giving my family pieces of my real life. My office, my colleagues, my cases, my schedule. My name in rooms where people lied under oath and signed documents with hands that shook. I had learned early that privacy was not secrecy when the people around you treated information like ammunition. So I let them think I worked around books. I let them think Grandma slipped me grocery money. I let them think my small apartment meant failure instead of caution. Richard took that silence and built walls with it. By midnight, Mateo found the first proof. A private investigator's invoice buried in Hearthline's formation packet, misfiled under vendor expenses. The description was vague. Background continuity review. The dates went back 3 years. 3 years. Not one angry search after Grandma resisted him. Not one desperate move when he saw me at the door with APS. 3 years of tracking my employment, my conference appearances, my professional publications under initials, even the relatives I avoided at family gatherings. Mateo leaned back from the terminal. He knew what you did. I looked at the invoice number until the digits blurred. Of course he knew. My father had not called me useless because he believed it. He called me useless because he needed everyone else to. The email came 2 mornings later, at 7:08 a.m., while I was still wearing the same sweater I had slept in on my couch. Subject: Opportunity to resolve a private misunderstanding. There was no greeting, no love, Dad. Just a time, an address in Harrisburg, and one sentence. This can still be handled inside the family. I forwarded it to Dana and Mateo before I answered. Then I wrote back, "I'll be there at noon." I did not bring case files. I did not bring the sewing box. I logged the meeting, shared my location, and followed the protocol we used when a witness might become hostile but still knew how to smile for cameras. My father's office was on the 9th floor of a glass building that overlooked a church steeple and a parking garage. The lobby smelled like lemon polish and expensive coffee. On the wall outside his suite were framed photographs of Richard Keaton shaking hands with pastors, veterans, widows, and men in suits who probably believed they were standing beside a generous man. The receptionist smiled when I gave my name. "Your father is wonderful," she said. "He helped my mother understand her Medicare plan after my stepdad passed." I nodded because I did not trust my mouth. That was what made Richard dangerous. He did not fake kindness everywhere. He spent it carefully, like money, so the right people would defend him when the wrong people told the truth. He was waiting behind his desk in a navy jacket, no tie, reading glasses folded beside a silver pen. He offered coffee. I declined. He smiled like he had expected that too. Then he slid a folder across the desk. Inside were photographs of me entering my office building, speaking at a conference in Pittsburgh, sitting beside Mateo at a courthouse cafeteria, walking out of a training seminar with my badge turned backward. There were copies of articles I had written under my initials, a list of cases I had worked, and a draft complaint addressed to the Inspector General. "You told the family you worked around books," he said. "Technically, I suppose case files count." I looked at the photos one by one. My hands stayed still. "How long have you followed me?" "Long enough to know you were most useful when everyone thought you were useless." There it was. Not anger, not surprise, confirmation. He tapped the complaint with one finger. It accused me of using government access to investigate relatives, fabricating concerns about Eleanor, and creating Hearthline to hide theft behind my badge. "You have 48 hours, he said. "Tell your grandmother she misunderstood. Tell your office, this was emotional overreach. Or I make your career look like the cover story it always was." For the first time that week, fear did not feel cold. It felt precise. I left my father's office without touching the complaint. That mattered. Richard had arranged the folder, so I would have to pick it up if I wanted to read the last page, and I knew him well enough by then to understand there was probably a camera somewhere that would make my hands look like consent. So I stood, thanked him for his time, and walked out with nothing but the memory of every page. By the time I reached the parking garage, my phone had 3 missed calls from my mother. The 4th came as I sat behind the wheel, staring at the concrete wall in front of me. "Mara," Celeste said when I answered. Her voice was too soft. My mother only sounded soft when she wanted something or feared something. "Don't go back to your office yet." I said nothing. "There's a clinic lot behind Street Agnes, on Willow Street," she said. "Lower level. 10 minutes. Then she hung up. I sent the location to Dana and Mateo before I drove. I parked 2 spaces away from my mother's white Buick. Celeste sat inside with sunglasses on, though the garage was dim and smelled like rainwater, oil, and old leaves dragged in under tires. She did not roll down her window until I was close. "I can't be seen with you," she said. "You called me." Her mouth tightened. For a second, she looked less like my mother and more like a woman who had just realized the house she helped build had no door for her to escape through. She held up a manila envelope. I stepped back. "If that's evidence, don't hand it to me." "Mara, please." "No. You give it to Mateo Alvarez or Calvin Reyes. You make a formal statement. You do not pass me anything in a parking garage, and then let him say I manufactured it." Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. Celeste had always been disciplined with tears. She saved them for rooms where they could change someone's mind. "Your father asked Dr. Crane to update Eleanor's chart," she whispered. "He wanted cognitive decline noted before the evaluation. Before the actual appointment." The garage seemed to go quieter around us. Dr. Hollis Crane had been my grandmother's family doctor for 8 years. He sent Christmas cards with watercolor barns on the front. Grandma trusted him because he remembered my grandfather's name. Celeste looked down at the envelope. I scheduled the appointment. I changed the pharmacy contact. I had some of her mail routed through the clinic because Richard said it was easier for records. Easier for whom? She flinched. "He said she was getting confused. He said you were waiting for an opening. He said if we didn't keep the story consistent, you would use your job to make us all look criminal." I almost laughed, but I hadn't. Celeste pushed the envelope closer, then stopped herself. "He has a file on you," she said, "in his private cabinet. The tab says Mara contingency." There was the word that made everything in me still. Not daughter. Not family. Contingency. My mother looked at me through the half-open window. I helped him, she said. I told people you were failing because it was easier than asking why he needed them to believe it. I did not comfort her. I only said, then stop making easy useful to him. Celeste did not become brave in that parking garage. People like to believe truth arrives all at once, like weather breaking open. But most of the time it comes in pieces people can barely carry. My mother was still afraid of Richard. She was still protecting herself. She was still trying to stand close enough to the truth to survive it, without admitting how long she had helped bury it. But she did one useful thing. She went to Mateo. By the next afternoon, Calvin Reyes had filed the first emergency motion, and Tessa Monroe arranged to meet Grandma Eleanor at her house, while Richard was at a luncheon for retired teachers. The irony of that nearly made me sick. He was standing in front of seniors with a microphone, warning them about scams, while the woman who raised my mother was sitting at her kitchen table trying to prove she still owned her own life. I was allowed to be present only as family, not as an investigator. That line mattered. I sat beside the window, hands folded, while Tessa placed a blank sheet of paper in front of Grandma and drew a line down the middle. On the left, she wrote care. On the right, she wrote control. She did not ask, "Did Richard steal from you?" Not first. That question was too heavy, and victims often protect the person hurting them because naming the harm means grieving the person they hoped was still there. Instead, Tessa asked, "Can you choose your own doctor?" Grandma looked at the paper. "If Richard agrees, can you go to the bank alone? He says it overwhelms me. Can you keep your phone with you? He charges it at night. Do you get it back in the morning?" Silence. The refrigerator clicked on. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower started. Ordinary life continuing the way it always does around private disasters. Tessa asked, "Can you refuse to sign something?" Grandma's hands folded together so tightly her knuckles paled. "He says refusing proves I don't understand." Calvin leaned forward, but he did not interrupt. That was what I liked about him. He understood that Grandma did not need another person speaking over her in the name of helping. Tessa tapped the paper gently. "Care gives you choices. Control punishes you for making them." Grandma stared at those words for a long time. Then she stood, slowly, and walked to the small bookcase beside the pantry. From behind an old church hymnal, she pulled out a folded document sealed in a plastic sleeve. "I signed this 6 months ago," she said, "revoking Richard's power of attorney. I tried to give it to the bank, but he found out." Her voice broke on the last word, then steadied. "He told me it didn't count, so I kept this copy because I wanted proof that, for one afternoon, I still knew how to say no." The emergency motion was granted the next morning at 9:17. Calvin called while I was standing in the hallway outside my apartment, holding a trash bag I had forgotten to take downstairs. For a moment, all I heard was traffic through the stairwell window, and his voice saying the words Grandma had been waiting to hear. Richard's authority was suspended. Hearthline's accounts were frozen. No one could change Grandma's medication, move her from the house, schedule a capacity evaluation, or access her bank records without court review. The order did not fix everything. Paper never does. But for the first time in weeks, my father could not walk into a room and make his version of reality the only one that counted. He reacted exactly the way men like him react when control stops working privately. He made it public. By noon, relatives I had not heard from in years were calling. Cousin Beth left a voicemail saying she was praying for my bitterness. Uncle Nolan texted that Dad had shown him documents proving I had been after Grandma's money for months. Paige posted a photo of a white candle on Facebook with the caption, "Some people will destroy a family for money and call it justice." She did not use my name. She did not have to. Grandma asked me to read some of it aloud. I didn't want to, but she said she was tired of being protected from the shape of the lie. So I read them at her kitchen table, while the copper teapot sat upright on the stove for the first time since the message. When I finished, Grandma held out her hand for my phone. Her fingers trembled, but she blocked every number herself. "I spent too many years keeping peace for people who never kept me safe," she said. I don't want peace if it means helping him lie. That afternoon, Leona Briggs from the bank called Calvin. She had kept internal notes from the day Richard brought Grandma in to withdraw money. The timestamp showed Grandma sitting in the lobby for 42 minutes, while Richard spoke for her at the counter. Marjorie Vale, the neighbor across the street, agreed to give a statement too. She had seen Richard remove mail from Grandma's box, turn away 2 women from church, and tell delivery drivers not to leave packages unless he was present. Each small witness changed the room. Grandma sat straighter every time someone believed a piece of her. Then, that evening, she made the decision none of us expected. I want a family meeting, she said. Calvin looked up from his legal pad. I said no before he could speak. Grandma turned to me. You have stood in front of me since this began. That's not a bad place for me to stand. No, she said. But this time, I want him to see I can stand in front of you. The meeting would be Sunday at 2, in Grandma's kitchen. She would tell Richard she was considering withdrawing her complaint if he explained Hearthline, returned control of her trust, and agreed not to place her in memory care. Calvin arranged the legal recording. Mateo and 2 officers would wait nearby. Tessa prepared an emergency plan in case Richard tried to overwhelm her. On Sunday, at 1:56 p.m., Grandma placed the copper teapot in the center of the stove, right side up. 4 minutes later, my father arrived carrying a leather portfolio thick enough to bury someone's life inside. Richard came in first, smiling like a man arriving to repair damage other people had caused. Celeste followed him with her purse held tight against her ribs. Paige came next, her face already arranged into sympathy, and behind them stood Dr. Hollis Crane, and a notary I had never seen before. No one had invited either of them. Grandma noticed too. Her eyes moved from the doctor to the leather portfolio in my father's hand, then to the copper teapot sitting upright on the stove. Richard set the portfolio on the kitchen table. Mom, he said, using warmth the way some people use gloves, we can end this today. Grandma sat across from him with Calvin on one side, and me near the doorway. Tessa was in the next room. Mateo and the officers were close enough that I could feel the fact of them, even when I could not see them. Richard opened the portfolio and spread the papers neatly. A new power of attorney, a revised trust, a medical authorization, a statement saying Grandma had been confused, frightened, and influenced by me. Dr. Crane placed his pen beside the documents like he had arrived at the end of a process instead of before an examination. Grandma looked at the first page. Why does Hearthline list Mara? Richard sighed, not angrily. Sadly, that was worse. Because you wanted her included, he said. You forget things when you're upset. I never asked for that. Mom, this is what I mean. You signed more than you remember. Every denial became proof against her. Every clear sentence was treated like confusion wearing confidence. Calvin asked Dr. Crane when he had last performed a full capacity evaluation. The doctor adjusted his glasses and said this was only preliminary. Paige leaned forward. Grandma, Dad is the only one who's actually been here. Grandma looked at her. Being present is not the same as being safe. For the first time, Paige had no quick answer. Richard's face hardened, just slightly. Enough. He pushed the papers closer. Sign these, and we keep this private. Refuse, and by Monday I'll petition to have you declared incompetent. Mara will be investigated. Celeste's name will be in every file, and you will end up in a facility where strangers decide when you eat, sleep, and take your pills. The room went still. Grandma reached into the pocket of her cardigan and took out a small recorder. I wanted to hear you say it, she said, while I still had the right to say no. Richard lunged for the table, but I stepped between them before his hand reached her. The kitchen door opened. 2 officers entered with Mateo behind them. Calvin stood. Mrs. Pritchard consented to the recording. Richard turned to Celeste. Tell them she agreed. My mother looked at the papers, then at me. No, she said. He told us what to say before we got here. Grandma picked up the new power of attorney. Her hands shook, but she tore it once, then again. You spent years calling my fear confusion, she said. Watch me understand you perfectly. Richard was arrested in Grandma's kitchen, not with shouting, not with broken furniture, not with the dramatic collapse people imagine when a powerful man finally runs out of room. It happened quietly. Officer Dallett read the charges, while my father stared at the torn papers on the table, as if paper had betrayed him. Coercion of a vulnerable adult, witness intimidation, forgery, interference with an investigation. Financial exploitation. When the cuffs closed around his wrists, he looked at Grandma first. "You're choosing her over your own family," he said. Grandma did not flinch. "I am choosing the truth," she answered, "over the son I kept inventing excuses for." After they took him outside, the kitchen seemed too ordinary for what had happened inside it. The teapot still sat on the stove. Dr. Crane's pen was still on the table. Paige was crying without making noise. Celeste sat with both hands pressed flat against her purse, like she was afraid something else might escape from it. The investigation lasted 5 months. Hearthline was not the only company. Richard had moved money through 4 entities, with names that sounded gentle enough to be printed on brochures for retirement communities. Investigators traced $263,800 in withdrawals from Grandma's accounts, a $418,000 loan against her house, $92,600 routed through Hearthline, and $176,400 shifted from retirement funds under the language of care planning. By the time regulators finished widening the circle, they had found other elderly clients tied to the same pattern. The total reached nearly $2.7 million. His insurance license was suspended, his office closed. Churches removed his name from donor plaques. Former clients came forward with stories that sounded painfully familiar. Children called greedy, widows called confused, friends kept away because stress wasn't good for them. Celeste cooperated. That helped the case. It did not repair us. Paige apologized once in a text, so long it looked more like a defense brief than regret. I did not answer right away. I was cleared after the internal review, but clearance is not the same as restoration. I lost the promotion. Some colleagues looked at me differently. My name still appeared, in one ugly blog post that no correction seemed able to bury. For a while, I checked my rearview mirror too often and slept with my phone face up on the nightstand. Grandma went home after the locks, accounts, doctors, and mail were changed. One afternoon, she handed me the old essay certificate from the lemon tin. "I should have framed this," she said. "You kept it," I told her. That was enough. For 11 years, my parents treated me like I was useless because they needed everyone to believe I had nothing. But the truth was simpler than that. I was never useless. I was dangerous to the lie they built. The lesson I carried out of all of this was not that blood makes a family, or that success will someday force people to respect you. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes the people who watched you grow will still choose the smallest version of you, because that version is easier for them to manage. They may call it concern. They may call it tradition. They may even call it love. But love does not require you to disappear, so someone else can feel powerful. What my grandmother taught me was quieter than revenge. She taught me that survival is sometimes hidden in ordinary things. A teapot turned the wrong way, a tin box on a pantry shelf, a document kept behind an old hymnal, a voice that shakes but still says no. Strength does not always enter the room loudly. Sometimes it comes in the form of one elderly woman deciding she has been silent long enough. And I learned something about myself too. For years, I thought staying quiet meant staying safe. I thought if I kept my real life separate from my family, their judgment could not reach it. But silence can protect you. Only for so long. In the wrong hands, your silence becomes a blank space where other people write their version of you. Family should be the place where your dignity is protected, not negotiated. Care should give you choices, not take them away. Love should make you more yourself, not less. So if someone in your life keeps calling you weak, useless, dramatic, difficult, or ungrateful, ask yourself who benefits when you believe them. Ask yourself what they lose if you finally stand up straight. My grandmother got her home back. I got my name back. But more than that, we both got the truth back. And sometimes, that is where healing begins. If this story touched something in you, tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to prove who you were to people who should have known already? I read your comments, and your stories matter. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for the next story.